Great morning. Did anyone get to enjoy the eclipse on Monday? I was kind of jealous. My brother lives on the East Coast and like they had like full darkness. Like ours was so uneventful, right? It was like if you had the glasses, you could see it, which was kind of cool. A few people let me look through their glasses after class, but it was just like we had a little bit of weird light versus like I have friends in like the East Coast. I have a couple who live in Texas, and it was like dark, right? That would be a little wild. It was kind of uneventful here. We had one last year that was almost the same way, where it was like the light was weird for like 15 minutes and then it just kind of moved on. So I don't know. Hopefully you got a chance to enjoy that. I saw a lot of people staring at the sun without glasses. I felt like a parent, like I'm going around yelling at people like, no, no, no. Yeah.
Will trend from my eyes and then use it by state,
Uh-huh.
then you'll notice that the states with those searches for my eyes hurt are in the valley.
Yeah, I believe it, right? I saw so many pictures of people looking at the sun, right? Yeah, we actually showed our kids a video because we had to have a whole lecture to them. We're like, okay, when you go to school today, you're not going to stare at the sun, right? This is what happens to your eyes if you stare at the sun. And they were like, oh, like they had no idea. So funny, and it wasn't just kids, it was everybody. Anyway, kind of exciting, but then we're back to normal now. Back to our normal, almost normal. We'll keep going with our chapter where we left off. We don't have a lot left of chapter 12, but we'll finish up 12 and then we'll get started on 13. And again, a lot of questions about the paper. A lot of you are asking questions about part 3. It is coming up. I'll probably talk about it a little bit more on Monday. So on Monday, we'll talk about a little bit of like what should be in the final paper. I'll show you some of those resources again on Canvas. That there's a bunch of them on there that could be really helpful for you. So on Monday, we'll talk a little bit more about paper part 3. It is worth the same as a test. So definitely be working on it, be thinking about it. And then on Monday, if you have any other questions, it'd be a great day. We'll look at some of the things to focus on for part 3. So to be coming up on Monday. Otherwise, we left off here, right? We talked about the course of schizophrenia, kind of these 3 phases that people go through. Again, a wonderful short answer question for you. And then the next part, like kind of the last piece of this is looking at what causes schizophrenia and then how do we treat it? And a lot of the causes have to do with biology, but there's a lot of biological elements to this. And I mentioned last time that there was a whole like study done. It was just a couple of years ago. It's this big meta-analysis. So they take all of the studies that have been done over time, and then they analyze those again. It's a really intricate statistical thing to do. And what they found is that there is kind of a genetic piece to this, right? That we're seeing that there are some genetic expressions that are correlated with schizophrenia. Hard to know exactly what that means yet, but there is a lot of thought that there's a genetic piece to it. And even beyond that, what we see is that there are a lot of components that are related to things like dopamine, related to genetics, related to diathesis stress. All of these are very biologically driven. And a big one with schizophrenia specifically, we talked about this before, like months back at this point, is something called the diathesis stress perspective. And what this means is that you're born with a genetic predisposition. So you're born predisposed to get schizophrenia. But whether or not you ever get it depends on the environment. It depends on if you ever have a stressor that activates that predisposition. Now, if you've ever heard of somebody having drug-induced schizophrenia, that drug use would be the like environmental stressor that triggered it. It could be something traumatic that triggered it. I had a student that was, we were like in the same cohort for my graduate program. And her husband, when he went away to combat, the stress of combat triggered his predisposition towards schizophrenia. And it came to the surface for the first time. So if he had gone to combat, he had never had that stressor, he might not ever have developed schizophrenia. So we see that the environment can trigger something that was already lying dormant. Now, we don't have a way yet to know if you're biologically predisposed, but if we identify the gene, we might be able to identify that precursor. But the idea here again is that either the use of a substance, traditionally like a psychedelic drug, or maybe something really traumatic or stressful can trigger that biological predisposition and have it come to the surface. So again, a bit of a genetic piece. And then the other really huge culprit is dopamine. Dopamine is what is thought to cause a lot of those positive symptoms of schizophrenia, the hallucinations, the delusions, the loose associations. So too much dopamine. And the treatments for schizophrenia really focus on reducing dopamine, right? And we'll talk about those a little bit later. But a lot of like very biological things. There's also some brain structures that are thought to play a role. People who have schizophrenia have smaller temporal and frontal lobes than we tend to notice in a typical brain. Now, is that causal or just correlational? It's hard to say. They tend to have enlarged ventricles within the brain. So there are a few things that we've noticed that are a little different in the brains of someone with schizophrenia, but it's hard to know exactly how those pieces contribute. And I have a little video that kind of highlights these things a little bit more. I'll play it for you. Thank you. It's not the most thrilling, but I think it's kind of helpful. And he has a follow-up that we'll watch later with the medications. But I think it's a nice kind of overview of some of these biological, helpful kind of overview of some of these things, kind of just putting them in a slightly different way, which can sometimes be a little bit helpful, right? And so again, a lot of like physical stuff, whether it's genetics or dopamine, or on a lesser level like serotonin and glutamate, that environmental stressor, right? The diathesis stress perspective. So a lot of biological things. We do look at like a couple of other elements, but these are by far less, right? They're like thought to be like adding factors, or like the first one is kind of an older take on what could cause schizophrenia. The biological stuff is like the main cause. But Freud believed in something he called the schizophrenogenic mother, right? And I tried to find a picture of a mom looking like cold and angry, right? I think I nailed it. But we'll see. But someone who was like cold, angry, domineering, right? Freud believed like that most things, like the mom and having a mom who was cold and harsh, could lead to something like schizophrenia, right? No evidence whatsoever to support this, but there is some evidence that the amount of expressed emotion in a family, right, could actually like exacerbate or be that environmental trigger that could cause schizophrenia to come to the surface. So if you have a family that's very like hostile and critical and a lot of like volatile emotion, that could be that environmental stressor, right, that brings it forward. So we tend to see that there is a little bit of like psychological stuff and cultural stuff. We don't fully understand why sociocultural factors play the role that they do, but it is thought that they have an influence, right? If you tell somebody that they have schizophrenia, they tend to like have their symptoms worsen. We talked about correlations with homelessness as people fall through the cracks, right? So there are some kind of little things here, but by far and away, it is the biological stuff that tends to contribute. And that very, very heavily drives the treatment for schizophrenia, as we have to change some of those biological elements to lessen the symptoms. So when we're trying to treat someone, obviously therapy alone is going to have some obstacles, right? If somebody isn't in touch with reality, it might be hard to do things like traditional talk therapy with them. So if somebody is hallucinating and having delusions and like they're paranoid, they're not going to trust their therapist. There are going to be issues there that serve as kind of roadblocks. And so we have to do more than therapy, but a lot of people will go to therapy as a way to get a little bit of support. And in the past, if you remember way back to chapter 1, which feels like a long time ago now, we talked about how for years we would just lock people away who had things like schizophrenia. And then in the 1950s, we shifted to that milieu therapy approach, where we wanted to treat people with like respect and dignity and give them meaningful activity and responsible behavior. Remember the like dance in a madhouse and some of the things like that we did very early on. And so when we treat people who have been hospitalized with schizophrenia, it's a very different approach than it used to be in the past, where we very much demonize that. And there's a lot of things called token economies that are used. And I would be willing to bet that like every single one of you at some point in your life has had a token economy. They're very, very common behavioral systems that are used for rewarding behavior. And so if somebody is like hospitalized and we're trying to teach them like meaningful, responsible behavior, we might reward them every time they do something appropriate, right? So maybe they get a check mark or a sticker or a point. And then when you earn a certain number of stickers or checks or points or whatever, you can trade it in for privileges. Like maybe it's a day pass, or maybe it's special rights, within that like hospital. We use this a lot with kids, right? Like my daughter, if she doesn't get in trouble, like at school, they give her like a little gold ticket. When she gets a certain number of gold tickets, she can trade those in for a prize. So these are very common programs that are used. And we sometimes will use it as a very concrete way to reward like desired behaviors and someone who's really struggling to carry out just simple activities. And so even at like an adult's level, someone who's hospitalized might have some of these programs to help keep them on track. The treatments, though, mainly revolve around medication. And the type of medication that you would take for schizophrenia, because it's a psychotic disorder, but you've lost contact with reality, we treat it with what are called antipsychotic drugs, right? They're fighting the psychosis. And these are drugs that tend to help, reverse some of that grossly like disorganized thinking, distorted thinking, the hallucinations and delusions. These were developed back in like the 1940s, 1950s, and some of the first like very widely used psychiatric drugs. They have a lot of issues. They're very difficult drugs to tolerate. And luckily we have some newer ones, but even the newer ones as a group, antipsychotic drugs tend to be very difficult. They have a lot of side effects that come with them, especially like Parkinsonian ones with like shaking and tremors. You see that a lot. Enough so that we sometimes call them neuroleptic drugs. So conventional, like the old school conventional antipsychotic drugs, tend to produce a lot of neurological issues. So they ended up being kind of referred to as neuroleptic drugs. They produce what are called extrapyramidal effects, shaking, bizarre like grimaces and twisting, extreme restlessness. They have problems, but they can also be incredibly helpful at the same time. There's even like kind of a long-term issue that you can get called tardive dyskinesia, where people have like tremors and seizures even years after using these medications. So just difficult to tolerate. They oftentimes require like blood work to monitor very closely. Thankfully, back in like the 90s, we started to develop a new group called the atypical antipsychotics. And these atypical ones are much better. They have less side effects, still very hard to tolerate. Probably the most common one here is Abilify, which I see commercials for sometimes on TV. But Abilify, Seroquel, there's a few that are newer. But just as a group, even though they help so much, they do produce a lot of very hard to tolerate side effects. So I'll bring that guy back up. As a side note, I feel like he is a little insensitive in this one. He says schizophrenics all the time. It's not the nicest. It's better to say people with schizophrenia, but I'll play it anyway. I think it's a good overview of some of these medications and their side effects. There are quite a few different antipsychotic drugs. So if somebody went in and is struggling with schizophrenia, right, they would typically start with these atypical ones, right? They would go down to that first because we don't want to go with the older, harder to tolerate drugs. But like with anything, like we talked about a lot with antidepressants, it can take a while to find the right one, the right dosage with side effects that somebody can tolerate. But these atypical ones, especially things like I said, like Seroquel and Abilify, are so much better than some of the older ones, but still can be hard to tolerate. And really cool, especially with these super fitting for the disorder, we have a lot more, as they were mentioning, injectable ones. So people will get an injection, which lasts for a longer period of time, which can help offset some of the tendencies people might have to like not take their medication or forget to take their medication, which is really common with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So focusing on that dopamine, glutamate, serotonin. It's interesting, right? If you think about like those neurotransmitters, they're kind of the culprit for just about everything, right? That we talked about, right? We have the same culprits, just different, concentrations or amounts of them. And so these medications are trying to alter that as well. One last thing, as we mentioned, therapy is helpful, but really not an option alone, right? And so we oftentimes have medication, maybe therapy. It was common for so many years to institutionalize people who are schizophrenia. And now we try really hard not to do that, right? And we talked about this back in chapter 1, that deinstitutionalization, trying to treat people in the community, can be a really helpful way of like helping, but it is also an issue that we get sometimes what's called the revolving door syndrome, especially with schizophrenia. People kind of get treatment, they're doing okay, and then they relapse and fall off their medication. And so they kind of fall through the cracks, they end up hospitalized, they get back on medication, they get grounded and they're okay. Released, they fall off the medication, they're kind of in and out like a revolving door. And that happens a lot when we don't hospitalize people. So we try and use a little bit more like halfway houses and community care. They have great promise, but a lot of people fall through the cracks, especially with a disorder where people are out of contact with reality. Makes it really easy to forget to take your medication, to forget to, follow that regimen. So it's important to have family support or friend support, and a lot of inadequate treatment here, right? Especially as we have less and less places where people can be hospitalized, and it's more and more expensive and harder to qualify for them. So a lot of treatment options, mainly focusing on medication, trying not to hospitalize when possible, but there are some issues with not, putting somebody in a care facility as well. So kind of a mixed situation. Any like questions, stories, thoughts, anything else related to schizophrenia before we move on from it? Any other like questions or thoughts or stories or comments or anything? Schizophrenia. Again, like I wrote up last time, a lot of great movies and books related to this one. Some of your characters, a few of you suspecting, just remember that schizophrenia and dissociative identity disorder very different, even though they oftentimes tend to be blurred together in the media. The media loves to blur them together, but they're very different disorders. Okay. So where we'll go from here for the rest of our time today is we'll move into chapter 13, personality disorders. Some of the most interesting disorders, but also some of the most controversial. But we'll go through these. We'll get started on them today. Bring this up here. Personality disorders, a lot of your characters in your shows, a lot of you suspecting a personality disorder. And what's tricky with these is we're in essence saying it's your whole personality that is the disorder, right? That's kind of a hard one to swallow, right? To say that everything about you is disordered, right? And so that's what makes these so controversial, for one. And for two, they can look very different from person to person, even with the same diagnosis. Like there's an incredible amount of variability and variety here. But every single one of you has a personality, hopefully just one, or you have dissociative identity disorder, right? One personality that makes you, makes you who you are, makes you unique from every other person in this room and on this planet, right? It is all of the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that make you you. All of your inner experiences, your outward behavior, and it's something that is very enduring. Our personality starts very young, and it tends to stay relatively steady. It can have some changes depending on the people in our lives, the people that we interact with and are in relationships with. It can change a little bit due to life experiences, but it tends to be pretty consistent. We tend to default back to who we are most of the time. It's hard to change our personality, which makes these disorders very difficult to treat as well. With a personality disorder, what we're saying is you have inflexible and maladaptive ways of thinking and behaving that start very early in life, and they cause a lot of stress. They cause distress in your life. They make it hard to have friendships and relationships and interact with other people. You aren't able to be flexible. So most of us, right, our personalities are a little bit flexible. Depending on who you are around, you can tap into different parts of who you are. You can maybe ramp up your extroversion in a situation where you have to be a little more extroverted, and like you can kind of adjust. Someone who has a personality disorder is very inflexible, very rigid, and they tend to default back to things that are very problematic, right? And again, this is controversial, but it is something that is recognized. There are 10 of them that we'll talk about. And they tend to fall into 3 clusters. Ones that are dominated by like odd, peculiar, eccentric behavior. ones that are kind of dramatic and emotional, and ones that are more like anxious or fearful in nature. So there's 10 different ones falling into 3 main clusters. And what we'll do for each one is we'll kind of talk about like what are some of the common presentations and symptoms. I have some video clips to highlight them. And then I'll write a few keywords for each one on the board to help you keep them separate, because they can be a little bit hard to keep separate. So here's a little like overview chart from your book, right? The odd eccentric ones, there are 3, anxious, fearful 3, and then dramatic and emotional, we have 4. So we'll look at each one of them, starting with the odd and eccentric ones. So we're going to start with a paranoid personality disorder. And again, what I'll do is I'll write a few like keywords and phrases for each one. So for paranoid personality disorder, I'm going to write suspicious, mistrustful of others, looking for hidden meanings, and like doubts about loyalty. So just kind of a couple of like defining characteristics of someone who has paranoid personality disorder. This has a lot in common with paranoid schizophrenia, right? And you'll even see, we just talked about schizophrenia, right? Schizophrenia, we have schizoid, schizotypal. We see a lot of like schizophrenia-like elements to the odd personality disorders. But the way that we tend to distinguish these is these are much more like spread out across all circumstances. They've been around your entire life. They don't tend to be as intense as somebody who's having like full-blown delusions and hallucinations. But to be fair, sometimes it can be hard to tell them apart. So we tend to look at severity and how global and how long it's been around. But paranoid personality disorder is someone who tends to be very suspicious of other people. They're constantly on edge and paranoid. They don't trust anyone. They feel like everyone is out to get them. Everyone is looking for like ways to use information against them. A lot of like conspiracy theory and paranoid thinking might be someone who has a lot of locks on their door, or lots of things to like set up so nobody can get in. Or they're always worried that, you know, someone is watching, right? And they're always looking for like those hidden meanings of things like that. Just very suspicious all the time. Believing that everyone means them harm, tend to have a hard time getting close to other people because they don't trust them, right? It's very, very common with this disorder that someone who has it ends up alone, or they oftentimes push people away with their lack of trust or lack of faith in them. And I have an example of this. He mumbles a lot, but from the movie Conspiracy Theory, it's kind of an older movie, but notice how he like has all these little setups to make sure that everything stays like locked and safe. And it's very common with this. And then he's looking for connections among things and conspiracies, hence the name of the movie. Has quite a few locks on his door. He has all his food locked up, right? Not a bad idea if you have roommates, I suppose, right? But he has everything locked because he's worried about contamination. People could get into it, right? And so all of his food is locked away. I always think it's so funny, right? Like you have one thing that really bothers him, but he was totally fine with hitting the bug with the spatula and then hanging it back up, which I'm like, oh, that's so gross, right? But he's so obsessed with like people breaking in. He's got the little trap on the door with a bottle in case somebody does break in. You'll know that the bottle fell down and broke, right? And then looking for connections among the headlines, right? So a lot of like suspicious and lack of trust and like trying to think or thinking that everyone is out to get you in some way. That's very common with this disorder. And again, has some elements in common with paranoid schizophrenia. A lot of like schizophrenia-like elements to these 3 that are under the odd cluster. Any thoughts or any questions or anything about the odd or paranoid? Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Like I said, they even just in name, they have a lot of elements in common with schizophrenia. Paranoid delusions are the most common type of delusions with schizophrenia. It just tends to be a little less severe, right? Like he still has a job and like he can often might struggle in relationships, but has some versus with schizophrenia, it's a little more like profound. Yeah,
And I'm having a little trouble understanding the definition of a personality because like it seems like the definition is like, if you go to CBT, it's almost like they're trying to change your personality.
mhm,
Even if you don't have like a personality disorder, but they're trying to change your inner thoughts, feelings, behaviors,
yeah,
and
which can affect your personality, right?
Yeah, yeah, so it's like, I don't know, like if you grew up like clinically depressed and that affects your personality, is that just like how does? I don't know how to explain what I'm trying to.
Sure, no, keep going with it. I mean, I kind of feel like I know where you're going, but keep going.
Yeah, like how do you distinguish that from like the personality disorder?
Sure. Yeah, it's hard because like depression, it's global, right? When someone's depressed, it affects their whole personality. It affects their behavior, their thinking, everything about who you are. But we don't consider it a personality disorder, we consider it depression, right? So with a personality disorder, like, so in essence, what we're seeing is someone who has like paranoid personality, right? Their entire life, they don't trust people. They have a hard time getting close to people. They're always looking for, like, they follow that pattern their whole life. The personality is dominated by paranoia, right? And enough so that it causes problems with their relationships. It causes problems at work. It interferes with their life in a lot of ways. So if somebody's diagnosed with depression, for example, right, it's going to affect their life in a lot of ways as well, but we don't consider it a personality disorder, it's depression. But CBT, like cognitive behavioral therapy, we're going to work on your thoughts, right? And then how they affect your behavior. So let's go in and look at your like automatic assumptions to try and change those to help alleviate the depression, right? So, I mean, I kind of see what you're saying. Like they're both very global in a way,
Yeah.
but it's what pattern of stuff do you have going on and which does it best fit?
Yeah.
But I mean, that's part of why these are so controversial.
I think that's why I'm just trying to understand like what specific, because like what's this specific thing kind of distinguishes
Mhm.
like someone who has a personality because of something that's not a personality disorder and is having issues in their life, and then someone who is having problems in their life because of a personality disorder. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. And it's not always easy to know, right?
Yeah.
So depression, you mentioned depression. Like oftentimes people who are depressed, they aren't necessarily, it's not their whole life, right? It might be some people have childhood depression and it persists their entire life. But these tend to be something that you see from a very young age. And it tends to only get worse as they get older, at least through like the teenage years. We try not to diagnose them until someone is about 18, actually. But they're often just these very pervasive patterns rather than like just related to mood, right? Like not to say that depression is just mood, but it is your mood that is disordered versus this is everything, right? This would affect the way that you interact with everyone, but it's controversial for the reasons you're thinking about. So I'd love that you're thinking about it. Other thoughts? Yeah.
That one thing to show it during the OCD, and it was like, I don't know what movie it was, it was like the lady, like inside the brain closed or something, and like, she had a bunch of locks and said, oh, don't go in or something, because like everything's locked for you.
Oh, yeah. From series of unfortunate events. With this one? So there's a disorder, it's my favorite personality disorder. If I could have a favorite, right? We'll get to it at the end. It's called OCPD. And so there's one that's very similar to that. So she has a lot of paranoid thinking as well, right? But hers is very like, I mean, it could be along these lines. We could go this way. Like, I think I'd put her as generalized anxiety because she had a lot of anxiety about everything. And it wasn't super like pronounced in the sense that she still had relationships and like was still able to function. This one is very specific to like paranoia. And she had some of that, but it was kind of across everything, right? But that's where it starts to get tricky, right? You take someone like that or someone who has depression, and what you have to do, and this is what you're doing with your character, is you kind of look at the person and what are their symptoms and what does it best match? Now, sometimes we're wrong and sometimes we have to change that. But like with this person, you would look at like the clip I just played, he's showing all those signs. And like with that character, she doesn't have a lot of the other stuff. And it was very event driven, like if you read the books or watch the movie.
These are also the longer anxious to in that.
Yeah, so these are like, well, it's dominated by like odd behavior, right? So more than being dominated by anxiety, it's more dominated by like odd, like eccentric, peculiar, odd behavior. Yeah. There was another hand I thought somewhere. And other thoughts or questions? I love that you're thinking about like issues, right? There's a lot of issues with mental health stuff in general. Like somebody could come in with an issue, with a problem with like presenting stuff, and it can take a long time to figure out what it is, right? And you might diagnose them with one thing when it actually fits something else. And we'll talk about that a little more when we get to borderline personality disorder, probably next time. That one is a disorder that is very commonly confused with things like bipolar disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Like a lot of them can present in multiple ways, making them hard to identify. Schizoid is the next one. So with schizoid personality, word up here. Spell this one on. So with schizoid personality disorder, I'm gonna write, this person seems to be very solitary. They show an incredible amount of like emotional coldness. So not a lot of emotional expression, not a lot of warmth. They tend to avoid social relationships and a very restricted range of emotion. If you remember back to the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, this individual fits a lot of those negative symptoms, not a lot of emotion, not a lot of warmth, not a lot of connections with other people. This person tends to be a bit of a loner. They're very distant, they're very cold. They tend to not engage in a lot of relationships. They might have very limited number of people that they connect to. I think a good example to like keep in your mind is like a schema for this, Batman, right? Batman, like the newer Batman movies, like Bruce Wayne would be a good example of someone who's kind of along these lines, like a loner, very isolated. He has a couple of people he cares about, but for the most part, his odd, peculiar behavior isolates him out and he's kind of alone, right? A very common to be alone kind of by choice, right? They just don't have a lot of emotion, a lot of warmth for other people. Take pleasure in very few activities, tend to do jobs that allow them to work alone or work on their own in some way. Odd and eccentric behavior, right? So again, like with Batman, right? Kind of odd, peculiar behavior that isolates him out. So not a lot of emotion, not a lot of relationships, very along the negative schizophrenia like symptoms with this one. Schizotypal, a little bit different. With schizotypal personality disorder, we have a lot of like odd, peculiar, eccentric behavior. Right, a lot of odd, peculiar, strange behavior that sets somebody apart. They oftentimes have like a lot of ideas of reference or like delusions of reference. So reading into things like deeply, sometimes having like really odd beliefs, like they oftentimes tend to think of themselves as having like magical powers in a lot of ways. So the magical beliefs. Right, believing that they have ESP or can see the future, or like maybe have like some kind of odd source of like sensing things beyond the norm. This person oftentimes ends up alone, but they can be intensely lonely, right? Like they want connections with other people, but their strangeness can kind of isolate them out. They might wear odd or bizarre clothing, tend to have a hard time like keeping a job and keeping relationships because of their peculiar thinking and behavior. So oftentimes they end up, as I said, feeling kind of alone. Now, I knew somebody in high school, right? I hung out with like really odd people in high school, right? I hesitate to tell you, but I'll tell you anyway. long years ago at this point. But I had a friend in high school that if I had to bet anything, like I have no idea where this person is now as an adult, I've tried, but I haven't been able to. I would bet my life that this person had schizotypal personality disorder. And just didn't know it, I didn't know it at the time. But I had a friend that everybody called knee pads, right? That was like her nickname across the campus. And it was because she wore knee pads to school and elbow pads and all sorts of like odd stuff that like you would notice. Like when this person walked by you, people would back up. They were terrified of her. So I was very safe. People were terrified of this person. They called her knee pads. She wore a trench coat all the time. And then this was at the time when Columbine happened. So they banned trench coats. So she wore a black sheet as a cape. And then was like, I dare you to do something about it. It's not in the dress code. A very bright person and was able to get away with that. She believed, here's where it starts to get odd. If that wasn't odd enough, let me add. She believed that she was half human, half dragon. Her dragon half was male and her human half was female. Really interesting stuff there, right? And we would be walking around the school and she would randomly stop and try to sprout her dragon wings. So we'd be walking and out of nowhere, she'd be like, I never saw wings, right? Like I was trying to sprout the wings. She'd flick people with her imaginary tail, was like a multiple degree black belt in karate. So again, everyone was terrified of her, which I think worked in her favor, but came from a really abusive, like awful household situation. Right. And so a lot of these like magical fantasy, like thinking ideas probably came from that. If I'm looking at it in a different lens, she believed that the world was going to end and that she could predict that and she would transition back to her dragon self. At 18, she changed her name legally to her dragon name. I wish I could remember what that was because that would help me find her probably. But I'm so curious now as an adult what happened to this individual. No idea. But it's that kind of stuff, right? That odd, peculiar behavior. You tend to stand out. And people tend to notice you. Lesser example, maybe a more like kind and relatable example, Luna from the Harry Potter movies, right? I would put her in this category as well, right? Kind of like odd, eccentric behavior. I have a little clip, peculiar, and just someone who tends to stand out. And again, you know, sometimes those magical beliefs can kind of come with this or like odd dress and kind of tendencies and habits. Very like peculiar, right? Which is why it falls into the group of odd, right? And where do you draw the line between odd and eccentric and peculiar and disordered? You know, that's not always clear, but it oftentimes what happens is it starts to interfere, right? And that's kind of the essence with all disorders. It crosses a line when it interferes with your relationships, when it interferes with your life, when it causes that distress and impairment. And that's what you see with all of these very like rigid, inflexible patterns of interacting with others across situations, starting from a very young age and persisting through most of your life. So those are the odd ones. Any other stories, questions, thoughts? Yeah. Yeah.
So what would you, like, how do you explain that?
I don't know. I don't know enough about that. I've heard of them, but
Like, it's a group that was in the 60s and
Right.
70s. And they all believed that they were from the stars and they had
Mhm.
powers, magical powers.
Yeah.
But during that time was a very, like, I don't know if
That wasn't super abnormal for their time,
Yeah.
right? Yes. And that's where it gets complicated, right? Like during that time, there were a lot of groups like that, more than now, like I would say anyway, or just different than now. And so it could be like kind of that shared delusion where everyone kind of comes together, just like an odd group. There are a lot of odd groups, right? Is it disordered or is it just strange? It's hard to say.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's a good example, right? And so like anytime you're looking at, and your book has another example, like those Michigan ice jumpers, right? Like to me, it would be super odd to get a group of people together and go jump in a freezing lake, right? But for that group, it's like fun and they all believe in it and think that like it's kind of a cool thing to do. And so sometimes it's so hard to know where that line is between like, you know, the believing that you have these abilities and powers, but then you find a group of people who also feel that way. And kind of influenced by the time, like, but it borders on this for sure, right? I would say that it's kind of bordering on some of those delusional thoughts, right? Especially how far do you go with those thoughts, right? Anybody else? Other thoughts, comments, examples, anything else stories, anything else here for the next group? The next ones are the dramatic personality disorders. So dramatic, emotional, a lot of emotional irregularity. These ones tend to be the most commonly diagnosed disorders within the 10. And the two that are up here on this slide are the most dangerous by far. One is most dangerous to self and one is most dangerous to others, right? Most dangerous to self will be BPD or borderline. Most dangerous to others, antisocial, right? So the two of them that are up here are definitely some of the more well-known personality disorders. So let's look at antisocial. Antisocial personality disorder. What are the common names for this? What are the common names that we always tend to call this? Yeah. Psychopath, one more. Sociopath, right? Psychopath and sociopath both refer to the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. So those are like the common names, just like Munchausen and factitious disorder are the same. Sociopath and psychopath refer more to the causes of the disorder. So what we tend to see here is this is the actual diagnosis. So like if you have a character that you think is a psychopath or a sociopath, you would diagnose them with antisocial personality disorder, right? Those are just more of the common names. Antisocial is kind of a confusing term. Antisocial means that you have behavior that lacks consideration for others, right? So that you're have behaviors that may cause damage to others or society, versus asocial is somebody who doesn't enjoy interacting with other people. So kind of a common confusion that we have with those terms. But some things we could write up here for this. The biggest thing, there's a lack of remorse or guilt. We'll talk about these more, but just to give you some phrases. Failure to respect lawful behavior. There's a lot of lying, conning, and deceit. Tend to be very common, kind of taking advantage of people. This is a really interesting disorder with a lot of characters throughout like the media portraying this. Tend to have somebody who has like a pattern of violent, criminal, or at least unethical behavior, right? They tend to not feel a lot of affection or deep caring for other people. They tend to violate other people's rights a lot, and they don't feel bad about it, right? There's a lack of guilt, a lack of remorse. Not feeling bad about doing so. Often lying, stealing and cheating, not showing a lot of like responsibility for their actions. Oftentimes this individual is very intelligent and charismatic. There's a superficial charm and charisma that tends to come with this. So oftentimes people with this will lure others in, and then what feels like out of nowhere can often turn on them, right? And then they don't feel bad for doing so, right? They have to show a pervasive pattern of not caring about other people's rights since they were little. So you see evidence of like bullying as a child, harming animals as a child, right? Getting into trouble with the law or in school when they're young. And then it escalates as they get older, and you actually cannot diagnose this until someone is 18. But this one has more rules than some of the others because it tends to be a little bit more like dangerous. A lot of characters, Hannibal, probably a great example, Dexter, another great example, Alex from A Clockwork Orange, Joffrey, Ramsay, well, there's so many in Game of Thrones, right? I could just go on with that one. There's a ton of examples of this in the media. People who, again, it doesn't always have to be violence. It can be more like manipulation and using people, but it can often present in a very violent, unethical, even criminal sort of way. One thing that we don't tend to talk about a lot is the lack of like empathy that we often see with this, like not being able to put yourself into somebody else's position, not feeling bad for other people, not being able to relate to other people. And I think you see that a lot in Dexter's character. Not so much if any of you have watched the old Dexter show, and then they made the like remake later of like the certain number of years later. In Dexter's character, he's not able to understand other people's like point of view. Like he tries to, he puts on a facade, but it's very difficult for him to have genuine empathy. And I found a little clip, someone made a montage of like him struggling to relate to other people. And I think it kind of sums up that piece really well. So let me play that for you, and then we can talk about this a little more. And just has to ask himself like what other people do. And it was kind of cool with this show that his dad or stepdad or however you want to refer to it, kind of tried to teach him a code, right? In the sense of like, how should I appear? Like he's often wearing this mask of trying to fit in, but then underneath it is like this brutal like murder, right? But has a code with which he does that. And what you often see with this again is that kind of like lack of understanding of other people and just not feeling bad for other people's struggles, right? And it can, as I mentioned, be very violent and like criminal. But at the very least, it's very like manipulative and oftentimes using people and not feeling bad about it. Yeah.
It's not a lack of emotion, right?
No, it's a lack of like being able to understand, of like empathy, right? Like, so if somebody like, like her husband died, right? And it's like, oh, like there's just like no like reaction to it, of like not being able to put himself in her shoes to understand how that would feel.
But if his partner died.
Yeah. Oh, he has a lot of anger, right? And a lot of like emotion. It's just not being able to like understand or empathize with another person's like reaction. And that's a very common, like understated element of this disorder. I think we tend to portray it as always being violent, but that is kind of like a hallmark of it, that lack of empathy and remorse or guilt. And then a lot of like lying and conning and deceitful behavior as well. Like take Hannibal, for example, or even Alex that's up here from A Clockwork Orange. Like they're both very like charismatic people. Like people follow them, like people are drawn to them, but they're incredibly dangerous at the same time. And oftentimes will kind of flip around and harm somebody in a way that can feel out of the blue because people might not see beyond the surface. Other like questions or thoughts or anything here? Yeah.
With Anderson personality sort of don't really, like it doesn't seem like they understand that they have problems. So
Right.
do people with that disorder ever see?
Often not, right? And a lot of these disorders, and we'll talk about that next time, there's so many barriers to treatment, right? Like, so with this individual, they're oftentimes not going to think that it's their issue at all. It has some elements in common with like narcissism in a way of like, oh, I don't have a problem, like it's not me who's the problem. So oftentimes this person wouldn't seek therapy or help, and could be quite a danger to the therapist actually. Very common with this one, right? And with all of them, like if you go back to these, right, like you're gonna have this one's not gonna trust their therapist, right? Like, and they're gonna think they're out to get them, and they have a hidden agenda. There's issues with treatment for these disorders. Great. Here's another, yeah.
There's this manga artist named Naoki Urasawa, and he writes like these little monster and 20th century boys. In both of these series, the antagonist fits in with a lot of antisocial. In one of them, they have multiple personalities, and one of them is antisocial, and it stirs the plot. But yeah, they write a really good antisocial antagonist, and they're very charismatic, and they start cults, and people like admire them and adore them, and like idolize.
Yeah.
They play into that and they use that to really keep it.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up like cults. Like that tends to be like there's almost like a cult like following that can happen with individuals who have this because they have such like superficial charisma and charm that people are drawn to them, right? So that's a good portrayal. Like it seems like that artist did their research really well, right? There tends to be that piece to it. And so oftentimes people might not see what's underneath until it's too late, right? Or until they've been harmed in some way by that person. Any other like thoughts or comments, examples, anything else with this one? It can be quite dangerous, right? As I said, most dangerous to others, right? By far. And then borderline is most dangerous to self. There's a lot of like self-harm and suicidality and impulsive, reckless behavior. Rather than jump into it for like 5 minutes and then stop, we'll end here. We'll start with borderline next month. And then, as I mentioned, what I'll do on Monday, after we either get close to or finish up the personality disorders, I'll talk a little bit about that third part of the paper, that final paper, But start thinking about it, kind of put it on your radar, that it's due in a couple of weeks, start kind of working on it a little bit and bring any questions you have on Monday. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you all then.